Hello, everyone. Welcome to the panel Who Speaks for God? How the Religious Right Betrays Faithful Americans. My name is Maggie Siddiqui, and I am the Senior Director of the Faith Initiative at the Center for American Progress, a multi-issue think tank based in Washington, D.C. The Faith Initiative is one of our policy teams at CAP, and we work to empower faith-based advocacy across all of our policy priorities, as well as to advance a progressive vision of religious liberty. I am proud to have organized today's panel with my colleague, Guthrie Graves Fitzsimmons, our team's non-resident fellow. I should note before we begin that we cannot see you all in the audience, so if you want us to know you're here, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. We'd love to know who's with us today. So the topic today is this: the political narrative around faith and politics is distorted because of the absolute obsession with the religious right. This obsession ignores public opinion polling about where religious Americans actually stand on these issues. It emphasizes the religious motivations of white evangelicals and Catholics, while de-emphasizing the religiosity of the rest of us. And so today I am excited to explore some of these dynamics with our amazing panel. And by the end of the hour, God willing, we can walk away with some ideas about not only how to neutralize the influence of the religious right, but also how to tap into the immense power and potential of the religious left. So I'm going to kick off with questions for each speaker and introduce them in turn. And after they've all spoken, I will pose a few questions to the entire panel, then open it up to the audience for any questions you all may have. So without further ado, please welcome Ashley Wilson to start us off, who as of this week was Grasstop's advocacy manager at the Friends Committee on National Legislation, a Quaker group, and as of next week will be the incoming Director of Communications for Catholics for Choice. She has a decade of experience organizing people of faith on issue campaigns related to immigration, taxes, healthcare, ending endless war, and more. Previously, Ashley was the communications manager for Network Lobby for Catholic Social Justice and organized 5 of Network's signature Nuns on the Bus trips. So Ashley, one of the biggest religion and politics stories right now is the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops infighting over whether to deny communion to our nation's second ever Catholic president. How do you view this debate? And also, what do you think it misses about Catholic views on reproductive freedom?
Thanks, Maggie. I'm so excited to be here talking about religion and politics. Simply put, what it tells me is this: Catholic bishops, especially in the United States, are out of touch. They're out of touch with the people that they're supposed to serve, lay people and Catholic sisters, and yes, even priests who overwhelmingly support legal abortion. I am not a statistics heavy person. That is Robbie's job on this panel, but nearly a quarter of all people in the United States who have had abortions identify as Catholic, and 68% of all Catholics in the United States believe that Roe versus Wade should not be overturned. But the bishops keep waging this losing battle in an attempt to remain politically relevant, when in reality, they're just driving people farther and farther away from the church. And the bishops aren't just out of touch with lay people like me and the nuns that I know. They're also out of touch with Pope Francis. Now, to be very clear, I think that Pope Francis also misses the mark. He preaches a pastoral approach, but there's nothing pastoral about calling 1 in 4 women in the United States murderers. But to his credit, he's been pretty outspoken about how communion is not to be used as a punishment. It's not a prize for the perfect. He even met with Speaker Pelosi this morning, which is really notable because the Archbishop of San Francisco has been targeting her specifically in the past few weeks. And apparently he's also going to meet with President Biden soon. So that's all far more than the US bishops are willing to do. So I could talk about this forever, but for me, the top line really is bishops are willfully out of touch, and ordinary lay Catholics actually understand separation of church and state and religious freedom far more than our so-called leaders do.
Thank you, Ashley. Powerful way to start us off. And I'm going to turn to evangelicals now, because that is another religious group often commonly thought of in the intersection of faith and politics. So I'm going to turn it over to Lisa Sharon Harper for her thoughts. She's the founder and president of Freedom Road, a groundbreaking consulting group that crafts experiences that bring common understanding and common commitments that lead to common action toward a more just world. Lisa is a public theologian whose writing, speaking, activism, and training has sparked and fed the fires of reformation in the church from Ferguson and Charlottesville to South Africa, Brazil, Australia, and Ireland. Lisa's book, The Very Good Gospel, was named 2016 Book of the Year, and the Huffington Post identified Lisa as one of 50 women religious leaders to celebrate. So very happy to have you here. Question for you. Evangelicalism really dominates our public conversation of religion and politics, but the focus is really on white evangelicals for the most part. What are we missing about the diversity of evangelicals?
Well, I let me just say, I love this question. And I also love CAP and all that you stand for, and working with you, Maggie and Guthrie, over the years. So thank you so much for inviting me to this conversation. First, I just want to say that there would be no evangelicalism today if it were not for Black evangelicals and other evangelicals of color. There was the First Great Awakening with Jonathan Edwards and others, George Whitefield, all of whom were slaveholders, and they were preaching about a white Jesus that somehow enslaved Africans and African Americans at that time, and free African Americans at that time. They saw something in this God-man named Jesus that was not typically seen by white evangelicals. The fact that he was colonized, and not only colonized, but colonized by an explicitly white supremacist empire, Rome. And so when they got hold of that text, it became a liberative text. They began to understand Jesus as a liberator. And they were the ones who spearheaded the Second Great Awakening, the one that had at its centerpiece the altar call. And the altar call was developed not only to get people, quote, into the kingdom of God, but also to get people, they understood you cannot enter the kingdom and be a proponent of slavery. So there were sign-up sheets for the abolitionist movement at the altar, but they also spearheaded and funded the abolitionist movement. So in the church, the evangelical stream today, there are actually only 2 in 3 evangelicals are white evangelicals. 1 in 3 are evangelicals of color. And that is made up by African Americans, by Pentecostals from the Southern Hemisphere, mostly Latin America, but also Africa. And throughout the world, globally, evangelicals are extremely diverse. And very few of them actually have a worldview that would comport with the white evangelicals of America that have been so distorted by rightward politics.
Thank you. Very, very powerful thing, and something that I think we often miss in terms of the diversity, even within evangelical Christians in America and, of course, around the world. So in that spirit of speaking about diversity here, we've discussed 2 Christian groups so far, and I want to pull in Simranjeet Singh for his thoughts as a Sikh leader and also commentator on religious pluralism. Recognized among Time Magazine's top advocates for a more equal America, Dr. Simranjeet Singh is the author of The Light We Give, The Power of Sikh Wisdom to Transform Your Life, as well as the incoming executive director for the Aspen Institute's Inclusive America Project. Simran is senior advisor for equity and inclusion at YSC Consulting and a visiting professor at Union Seminary. He's a 2020 Equality Fellow with the Open Society Foundations and a senior fellow for the Sikh Coalition. This past year, Simran released his best-selling children's book, Fauja Singh Keeps Going, the true story of the oldest person to ever run a marathon. Welcome, Simran. So as I've just alluded to here, discussions about religion and politics too often focus exclusively on Christians, even in discussions about religious liberty, which is presumably most intended to protect the rights and safety of religious minorities. How do you think progressives can reclaim the conversation on religion and politics and on religious liberty in particular?
Yeah, thank you, Maggie. And I'll start by sharing a little story that I think might help illuminate what we can possibly do as progressives. So when I started dating Ganesha, who is now my wife, she was in medical school at the time, and her best friend, Ben, came out to her as gay. And Ben and I hardly knew one another at the time. We lived in different cities. My now wife and I just started dating, but he asked her not to tell me. And later, when she asked why, she found out that it was because Ben came from a devout Catholic family who was not okay with his being gay. And he told Ganesha that he assumed that the same would be true for me because I was visibly religious. And Ganesha explained to him that it wasn't like that. And Ben and I now look back at that assumption and we laugh. But I think that simple example shows us something about our own assumptions, our assumptions about religion and our assumptions about politics. Namely, so many of us carry this bias, including myself, that religion and conservatism go hand in hand. And that progressive faith is anomalous, if not paradoxical, right? Because we're so often shown images or told stories or fed news about religion and conservatism being tied together that we forget that there are progressive people of faith out there. And what I want to share is that religion is neither. Right, that our biases about religion, because of negative perceptions and negative experiences, our biases can lead us to make assumptions that effectively exclude people who would otherwise be part of the progressive vision. So if we want to have a big tent, if we want to be more inclusive, right, these are some of the values of the progressive movement, then we have to be more intentional about creating a culture and an ethos that welcomes all those who wish to join. And the first step to doing that, and so many of us have been doing this in different contexts, we don't often think to do it about our assumptions around religion. The first step to doing any of this is to start examining our biases about the intersection of religion and politics, particularly what do we think when we think about religion in relation to progressivism? This is a step that I don't think progressives have taken yet as a collective, and it's an important one. And I think it's important because there's another impact that I want to share with you all, that when we act on these biases and we effectively exclude people from our vision, whether it's intentional or not, that pushes people like me and like many of my friends from other traditions, it pushes us further out into the margins. And that exposes us to further harm. And that's not a progressive value either. And my sense is that we don't intend to do this. But the reality is, and I can share this from my own lived experiences, this is the impact. The feeling of being excluded is real, of being unseen or rendered invisible is real. And the consequent harm is real too. So just to sort of wrap this up, I don't believe that this is intentional. Our values as progressives is to be inclusive, is to lift up one another's boats. But even so, it seems to me that we can be doing a much better job of bringing one another in, being more considerate of where people are coming from and how to make sure that they're feeling represented and their voices are heard and that they're welcomed. And so the step that I think that we should all be taking, both individually and collectively, is to start examining and excavating the biases that we carry that have to do with religion as it pertains to politics. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Simran. And this is an important a reason why we're having this panel itself. So really happy to get into all of this with you all. In all of this work, it is always incredibly important to ensure that our ideas and our thinking here are backed by data. And that is where our next speaker comes in. Dr. Robert P. Jones is the CEO and founder of Public Religion Research Institute, or PRRI, and the author of White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, which won the 2021 American Book Award. He is the author of The End of White Christian America, which won the 2019 Grawemeyer Award in Religion. He also writes a weekly newsletter for Substack at robertpjones.substack.com. So question for you, Robbie, what are some of the biggest myths about religious Americans? What about your data surprises people the most?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much, Maggie and Simran and Ashley and Lisa. So happy to be here with you. And I do think that one of the things that data can do is help us get beyond our assumptions and our stereotypes. And, if we're thinking about a struggle, a political struggle, we have to really understand what the lay of the land really is, and to get beyond some just, I think, kind of broad ham-fisted assumptions. And the landscape has been changing. I think that's also certainly important to say. One kind of example, I'm usually in Washington, D.C. I'm sitting right now in Owensboro, Kentucky, where I've been invited by the Third Baptist Church to come join the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship and an entire weekend thinking about white supremacy. And the role of Baptists in Kentucky on white supremacy. Now, this is not something that I think even 5 years ago, I would be an invitation I expected I'd get, but here we are, right? And so I think there are, conversations happening and movements happening that are important to note, and opportunities for partnerships that may not have been there before. Just a couple of big picture things. I do think that one way we can get clear is, if we're talking about kind of the group that, in the topic, Who Speaks for God, the group I think that unfortunately too often it gets that microphone or that megaphone are one very particular group, and that is white evangelical Protestants, right? We've already mentioned, this, but I think they often stand in for the entire diverse, religious community that's here. And one of the things that I think people are surprised to know is that in the changing demographics of the country that we have, particularly over the last year, that we've actually passed quite a significant threshold in this country. The country has, for most of its history, been demographically speaking majority white and Christian, and it is no longer majority white and Christian. And in fact, during Barack Obama's presidency, that period was when we passed from being a majority white Christian country to one that's no longer majority white and Christian. At the beginning of 2008, the country was 54% white and Christian. Today, that number is 44% white and Christian. And that sea change, I think, is actually part of understanding some of the visceral reactions that we see among very alarmed white Christians, that they are kind of moving more to the margins and out of the center. The other thing I would say is that white evangelical Christians, back in 2006 or so, were about a quarter of the country. Now that's a big swath, but today their numbers have been dwindling, and today they only make up 14.5% of the country. Let me say that again: white evangelical Christians that get all the attention make up 14.5% of the country today, right? And those numbers have continued to slide. Their median age is 57. Right, and it continues to creep up as they're losing young people, mostly over this last year. And the last thing I'll say, just to kind of prime the pump here a little bit on issues that Ashley and Lisa and Simran have brought up, is that the assumptions about where religious people are over issues like abortion, over issues like marriage equality or LGBTQ rights, is often really dated and out of whack. And so, just give me one example. Today, we used to think of those issues, I think, or many still think of those issues as religious versus secular issues. But on the issue of marriage equality, for example, there's only one religious group, that opposes marriage equality, and that is white evangelical Protestants, that make up, again, under 15% of the country. Every other major religious group in the country is majority support for marriage equality. Even on the issue of abortion, it's worth noting that evangelicals are by far the group that is most opposed to the legality of abortion. But even there, it's only 1 in 3 that oppose legality of abortion in all cases. Right. So even among the most conservative group on that issue, and as Ashley said too, I think people are always surprised, but I think I always see jaws drop when I say, when I highlight this gap between the Catholic hierarchy and rank and file Catholics in the country, both white and Latino, by the way. So on marriage equality, white Catholics, Latino Catholics, both strongly in favor of marriage equality, both also a majority in favor of the legality of abortion in the country. But I think because the official church hierarchy has a position, there's an assumption that everyone falls into step. So there's much more fluidity, I think, in the American religious landscape. And I think the key is that we just can't let one group, especially a shrinking group, stand in for the whole here. It really distorts our ability to see the landscape in front of us.
Thank you so much, Robbie. And I have certainly in my work have found your data to be incredibly helpful in really like concretely illustrating that gap between the narrative and the reality on the ground. So I'm going to open up a few questions for the whole panel now. And for those of you in the audience, feel free to start dropping your questions in the chat, and we'll move to those in a few minutes. So first question to the title of this panel: who speaks for God? May sound slightly blasphemous, a question, so apologies for that. But that is really what the religious right is often proclaiming to do. So in conversations on public policy, what are the religious voices? How do we recognize the religious diversity of our country on these issues of public policy? Whoever wants to start. Maybe Ashley.
So I have a little bit of a glib answer, but I'm really excited about this. In who speaks for God, my answer is both everyone and no one. My faith teaches that there's that of God in everyone. So I believe that to some extent, and certainly now I work for Quakers and they have no hierarchy. So to some extent, I believe, yes, everyone speaks for God. And when I'm bringing faith leaders in to meet with members of Congress, like they are speaking as faith leaders, whether they're a Quaker layperson or a Catholic sister or just a person in the pews. And at the same time, the reason why I say no one is because I am immediately wary of anyone who claims that they speak for God. So that was everyone and no one was my answer to that question.
Thanks, Ashley. I want to add to this as well. I mean, I think that when I asked the question as an evangelical, I was taught that we speak for God as evangelicals. That was what we were taught. We were taught that our goal was actually dominionism without even the name. That was it's a language of the scripture that it's a proponent of evangelicals kind of becoming the rulers of the world because we're the ones who speak for God. That quickly got turned on its head when I began to realize that those evangelicals that were doing that, propagating that idea, were all white and male. And they had an idea of the world as it should be that had white men at the top. And that's the world they were trying to push forward through the lens or the portal of white evangelicalism. Now what I understand is that the scripture exists to help guide us through this life. As I understand my faith, we were conceived in the mind of God, and that mind, God, is our home, and that every step we take on this earth is meant to get us back home. That's the goal of life, is to get us back home into the arms of God. And so how do we live this life? We live this life under the ethic of God, under the ethic of in the Christian tradition, the reign of God, which is a peaceable kingdom, which is a peaceable kingdom, where we understand that we are all related, we are all tied together. And what it looks like to have peace is not just to have the absence of war, but rather to have the presence of radically good relationship between all things, not only humans and God, but also humanity and the rest of creation, and all of creation, including us, and the systems and the way things run and work. So what does that look like? It looks like me entering into the political sphere, entering into the public square, calling for an ethic of love. If I can call for an ethic of love, that is a universal ethic that can stream across religious faiths, and can move our nation toward that beloved community vision that Dr. King painted.
Beautiful, Lisa. Simran, Robbie, either of you want to get on this question about how do we recognize the religious diversity of our country?
Yeah, I'm going to get to one of the pragmatic problems with that, because I think it's maybe important to say a little bit about that. I think the way that you can't, sort of as a religion scholar, you can't really understand religion without a racial and ethnic lens on it in this country. And so I think that's one of the biggest important things. So even the term like religious right, I always bristle a little bit. It really is the white Christian right that we're talking about here. And Christian nationalism, I always bristle a little bit. It's white Christian nationalism. It is an ethno-religious identity that we're really struggling with in this country. And so kind of just being clear about that. And the ways that shows up in our electoral politics are really stark. That, for example, if you can ask me to, give me 20 seconds, you got to describe the American religious landscape's voting patterns. I could boil it down and be fairly accurate by saying, well, since Reagan, white Christians have voted for Republican candidates and everybody else have voted for Democratic candidates. Like, that's a fairly accurate description of now, why should that be? What's going on there? Like, that's a little nuts when you think about that's the way the voting patterns shake out, but they're true. It was true 2016 and 2020. The only group that is a little bit of an outlier in the last decade are as the growth of Latino evangelicals have Latino Protestants that are mostly evangelical and charismatic. They have really borrowed not only kind of the theology of white evangelicals, but often the politics of white evangelicals. They also voted about 6 and 10 for Trump, for example, in the last election. But that's the kind of one example. But it really is this kind of bifurcation. Now, what that means, right, is if you're a Republican leader or a candidate running for office, you have a very homogeneous group that you can speak to, right? It's very easy. You can just kind of speak the language of white Christian nationalism, and you've got a kind of ready audience. If you're a progressive or Democratic candidate running, you've got this vast diversity to speak to. And I think there's a kind of built-in challenge there that there's an easy megaphone that you could just kind of hit this kind of one note among kind of Republican politics in a way that you really have to speak, frankly, to the rest of the country if you're running on the kind of progressive side of things. And I think so on the pragmatic side, I think one of the reasons why we hear more and it's easier to for that to break through in the media is because it is a kind of monotonic, single note kind of religiosity that's being struck in the public versus what happens on the kind of the more progressive side of politics.
Simran, did you want to add something there as well?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I love everything that everyone said, and I think what Robbie's calling our attention to that I just wanted to sort of highlight for us and lift up is, Ashley's absolutely right that anyone can speak for God, everyone speaks for God, but there's also a question of whose voice is heard, and that's a question of power, right? So to understand religion as it functions within politics in this country, I think Robbie's right on point to say, we have to understand racial and ethnic dynamics here. But what we're really looking at here is who has power, whose voices matter, whose voices count, and what are the ways that these perspectives come to be normalized to the point that we presume them to be normative, right? So if we take that just very briefly as using race as an analog, we presume whiteness to be the norm, and every other identity is hyphenated, right? We have to describe who they are because they're outsiders. And the same is true with religious minorities in this country. And so when we start, even now, as we're starting to bring some progressive religious diversity to the table, it's still not an even playing field. And to miss the dynamic of power in this is to miss the point. And I just think that's really important. Thank you.
Thank you for adding that. And Lisa, you wanted to add something else on this?
Yeah, just a quick thought. Stemming from something that Robbie said, there's a misconception, I think, that goes back. If we were having the election of 2016 or 2008, then I would say that the most powerful bloc within evangelicalism are white evangelicals. But after the death of George Floyd last year, white evangelicals, like everyone else, were largely turned on their ear. I think it goes to stand that it's part of the reason why I was recently invited to speak to Campus Crusade for Christ. Hello, the word crusade is in the name. International, the global or the European version of Campus Crusade for Christ, right? There is a hunger within that space, but here's the crux. Evangelicals of color are the ones that, by and large, the stream of evangelicalism, which is a significant stream, that pushed the Second Great Awakening, that pushed the abolitionist movement, that stream is now open again to being led by evangelicals of color. And that's why we focused on having the leadership of evangelicals of color during the 2020 election. And it was that leadership of evangelicals of color that we believe turned a significant portion of white women in the suburbs who count themselves as evangelicals toward a liberative and beloved community vision as opposed to a white American vision.
Thank you for that. And I want to move on to the next question. I'm thinking about what Simran said about who has power. How do we turn that on its head in the context of religious Americans, knowing that so many, as you phrased, Lisa, like they come to this work of public policy with an ethic of love. They're driven by their faith, rooted in their diverse backgrounds. How do we as progressives harness the power of that? There are a lot of folks here in the audience. Some of them may be religious, some of them may not be, but in both cases are likely organizing with quite a few progressive people of faith. What advice do you have for those organizers in the audience?
Can I jump in here? As someone who has spent, the past decade working with secular and religious folks in coalition, everyone from the House Democratic Working Group led by Whip Clyburn to unions and other secular groups, Quakers work really closely with groups like Win Without War. Nuns on the Bus worked really closely with the Amalgamated Transit Union. My answer to this question is please, please, please just work with the people who are already doing it. You do not need to go and create your own faith-based effort. Like name an issue, any issue. There are people not just across the country, but like probably also in Washington, D.C., sitting around the same coalition table that you're or Zoom meeting that you're a part of, whose literal jobs and expertise is how to walk into a faith community and talk about this issue and mobilize them for whatever action, whether you take more of the pragmatic approach of like nonpartisan meeting with Republicans and Democrats alike, or more of the direct action, staging a sit-in in the speaker's office. And you can tell I get edgy about it. But the thing to me is like, we do not need to reinvent the wheel. These organizations are doing incredible work and are often so underfunded that working in partnership is not just important for like advancing the movement. It's also important for like building that bridge and making that collaboration sustainable. So that's work with the people already doing it.
I'd love to add to that, Ashley. I think that, first of all, Ashley, you totally stole my thing. I was going to say that exactly. And I'll add to it just by saying that I think that the main thing that gets in the way of people of faith coming on board with progressive ideas and progressive vision is that it tends to be spoken in the language of politics, in the language of and secular language, without respect to the faith frames and the faith values that are already embedded in our scriptures, in our sacred texts, in the lives of our saints and the people who came before. And so I am a strong proponent. I'm going to borrow from my friend Alexia Salvatierra. I'm a strong proponent of faith-rooted organizing. And so it is necessary. One of the reasons why what Ashley said is so important is it's necessary to be able to organize people from the roots of their faith, not just to organize people of faith, but rather to be able to organize them from the roots. So when I'm organizing evangelicals, and I do, and not only evangelicals, but also historic Protestants and Catholics, what are their sacred texts? What do those sacred texts tell them? And actually also in multi and interfaith settings, the same is true. I've done faith-rooted organizing training for multi-faith gathering in partnership with the Interfaith Center of New York. And that is some of the most powerful, profound conversations we've ever had. Why? Because people are realizing they don't have to go very far from their faith to get to the same policies that we want to push on Capitol Hill. In fact, their faith might even call for something even more radical than the general progressive movement is calling for. So organize from the roots. And in order to do that best, go to the people who are already trained to do it.
I'm just going to add one little coda to this from my corner of the world. Amen and amen. I think that progressive organizing often starts with economic interest and that model, and that's a very powerful model with a long history. And I think it's something I want to applaud. But I think wedding to that, not that approach is often not that resonant in faith communities, and that wedding that to values, right? So yes, interests, but values, and kind of making that connection. And the other thing to say again, this may be Ashley, maybe my pet peeve, is somehow I think in many progressive circles, there's all this careful polling done for general progressive organizing, and very little scientific research done for faith organizing, right? And again, there are people doing this work. There's data out there. There's data available. And, the same kinds of thinking, testing, careful thought process. I'll just give you one quick example on the immigration front. Welcoming the stranger, right? Sounds like a great progressive value. It sounds like a great religious value. It turns out it's a terrible activist approach on immigration, and and we only found that out by doing some research on it, and we found that everybody was reacting negatively, and we finally did some focus groups, and it turns out that part of the problem was that people were instead of hearing the biblical injunction to welcome the stranger, they were hearing, particularly parents, were hearing stranger danger. Right? That we protect our kids from strangers. We tell our kids not to talk to strangers, and that this was a kind of conflict. Anyway, but there's data and research that you can do even in this space to use the same kind of care and precision that's done, I think, often in other spaces to talk to other subgroups. And one last thing is that it is almost never a good idea to use a Bible verse, just almost never, and it just sounds ham-fisted and trying too hard, but the values piece that Lisa and Ashley that's the sweet spot, I think.
Yeah, I'll say +1 on the values. I think to me that's what really I found to be effective in moving people. And the other thing that I want to add, and this goes back to my point around the bias that so many progressives carry where there's almost an allergy to religion, right? We're sort of open to all other kinds of identities, but as soon as religion is brought to the conversation, we shut down and we say, we're not really about that. And there are all sorts of reasons why, and we can talk about that and we can explain a lot of it. But I think the focus here for me is what do we do about that bias? And one of the things that I found really powerful and effective through bias-related trainings is this very simple ground rule that so many of us have heard so many times, and we've learned to apply it in our lives. We say, meet judgment with curiosity. And I think, so often, and especially when it comes to religion, it's easy for us to judge people who are of different religions than us, people who practice religion differently than us, people who practice religion, right? These are all different kinds of biases that we carry. So if we can make that a principle in our organizing and say, when I meet someone who's different and who's motivated by something different or whose worldview is even different, instead of saying, they're not with me and I'm not with them, just pause for a moment and figure out where the point of connection is. And I think that can create a different kind of relationship with a positive outcome.
Thank you, all of you. That was incredibly rich. And Simran, your comments provide a helpful segue to my next question, which is, I think for some, there's sort of there may be a bias against religion for some reasons. For some, it's because of bad experiences, perhaps with their own religious community or with other religious institutions where they felt hurt or excluded. And in those circumstances, I think it can be challenging to figure out how do you go back in that space to advance whatever the progressive vision is that you'd like to see. So what message do you, this is to all of you, again, any of you who want to jump in, what message do you have for those who are wary of any talk of religion in these spaces?
I'd like to jump in here. I think that 70% of all Americans claim to be people of faith. And so if we are not able to speak in the language of faith, if we are not able to engage their faith, then we will not be able to reach 70% of Americans with our message, at least not into the deepest parts of who they are. The Miroslav Volf, theologian based out of Yale Divinity School, he says that it is thin faith that has caused the majority of the oppression that we see in the world, not thick faith. Thin faith is the kind of faith that quotes a Bible verse. Thin faith is the kind of faith that can be manipulated as the winds turn and cause people to say yes to slavery, yes to women's subjugation, yes to LGBTQ subjugation, yes to pro-life without actually even checking the scripture just because their pastor told them so. Thin faith is what is dangerous, but thick faith plumbs the depths of that faith tradition and goes deep into the scriptures and usually comes out, ironically, on a very progressive scale. It comes out on a pushing for policies and a vision of the world that lives according to that love ethic. So it is not wise for us to push faith out of our fight. Rather, the wisest thing is to push for deeper faith and to plumb the depths of faith in order to push for our vision of the world.
And I agree with everything that Lisa just said, and also just want to say for people who might be out there either listening to this panel now or listening to recordings later or in a conversation on Monday or Tuesday when someone says, we need to organize faith people. I just went to Netroots Nation and heard about this. If you are someone, like my faith in particular, I know has caused a lot of harm to people. And for that, I am sorry. And if you are one of those people, you do not have to do faith organizing. You can leave it to people like me who signed up for it. And that's just, that's part of the beauty of working in community and in relationship with each other. So I agree with everything that Lisa just said. Like, for the movement, there is an importance to faith organizing. But if that is not a place where you are safe, leave it to the people who are willingly signing up to do that work, because we are willing to do it for you and with you.
I also find that a lot of this work is deeply pastoral. And I think for a lot of the organizers in this room, I imagine whether or not you're organizing in faith communities, you're finding yourself playing this pastoral role of caring for your communities. And I have found that in faith organizing, there is the kinds of reactions that we get when we advocate for LGBTQ equality, for example, shows that the work that we're doing is both political and pastoral as well in this faith organizing space. So sorry for that aside. I want to turn now, make sure we get some questions from the audience in here. We've gotten a couple so far. The first is directed to Robbie, but I want to kind of open it up for the group as well if others want to jump in. The person says, I would like to know Dr. Robert P. Jones's thoughts on Steve Bannon and his ilk. Do you think people like him are twisting the words of the Christian church in order to justify their own bigoted worldview?
Thanks. Small question. I'm going to actually pair it with the next one that I see Ellen mentioned here about the influence of alt-writers going orthodox. So I think these are actually linked. One of the things that we have seen really over the past, through the 20th century, particularly the last half of the 20th century, is that as the numbers of kind of white Protestants, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants that have been so dominant in American history have shrunk, their allegiances have expanded, right? So it was sort of the kind of white evangelical, the white mainline Protestants. But in the 90s, we started seeing these bridges being built with white Catholics in the country, which would have been anathema generation before that, right? The people didn't even think Catholics were Christian in many Protestant circles, even a generation before. But there was a political necessity as the numbers were shrinking to expand that out. And I think that one of the things that's happened with Bannon and others in the Orthodox, the real attraction to like the Russian Orthodox Church, I think that we're seeing in many Christian circles, is this blend again of ethno-religion's identity, right? And in that case, explicitly nationalist, right? Tied to a state identity. And there's a kind of Christendom, white European Christendom being recreated there. And, we're looking on Monday to Indigenous Peoples Day on Monday. And I'd say that like one of the things behind all of this that is rearing its head again is this old doctrine of discovery literally out of the 15th century with Columbus and Spain trying to justify their claims on the Americas. And the church giving the blessing to those claims. And if we go back to that, this idea is still with us today. And it is basically this. Those church doctrines, the doctrine of discovery declared that if any Europeans who were sailing under the flag of a Christian king or queen came upon non-Christian peoples anywhere in the world, they had the authority of the state and the blessing of the church to seize those lands and dominate those people, right? And it's that old vision that it just keeps rearing its head. And so that's why I think the orthodoxy that's a tie to a kind of European ethno, kind of white identity plus Christendom plus the state, all that power together is really kind of what we're struggling with. And to the quick question of whether they're twisting the words of the Christian church, I don't actually think that's quite right. I think they're using the words of the Christian church. And that's the thing we've got to wrap our heads around, that those words are there. And that tradition is there. Now, there are alternate traditions as well that Lisa was pointing to. And that's the fight, right? Is that which of these Christian traditions are going to win? It's not that one is Christian and one is not. They are actually both Christian, right, historically. And so the question is, which of them is going to win out?
Can I add to that, Maggie, that we have to understand that our current struggle, and Steve Bannon is, I'm so glad, Michael, that you mentioned him. I was down in Brazil speaking at the largest evangelical church in Brazil, a Baptist church that was settled by the Southern Baptists down there. And I didn't know this going in, but I heard that Steve Bannon was actually the political advisor to Bolsonaro and helped him to get elected. So Steve Bannon and that who helped Trump to be elected is also working around the world trying to get other dictators and fascist rulers also elected. This is important because we have to understand that we're not just living in something where people are taking individual action based on individual need or justification. You asked the question specifically in order to justify their own bigoted worldview. When the religious right began, it did not begin to justify its worldview. It began to take us back to pre-Civil War era. It began to change the politics of our world, to change the way we live together in the world in direct response to the civil rights movement. So it is that civil rights movement that catalyzed the response, which we now know to be the religious right. It is the presidency of Barack Obama and the shooting through the roof of the Black Lives Matter movement last year that has catalyzed January 6th. So when we look at the movement of people like Steve Bannon, they do not speak for God and they do not speak for the church. They are political operatives only.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm realizing we're getting short in time, so I am going to move ahead to what I think will be our last question here. A person in the chat asks, how can we combat the money and power inherent in evangelical churches in the Deep South? It's just an easy question.
Well, okay, so here's coming back in. Here's the thing. When our bias actually comes into play here. When we think of money, we think white. When I thought of the abolitionist movement, I was amazed to find out that the abolitionist movement was primarily funded by rich Black people back in the turn of the 19th century. Yes, the Fortin family, the Purvis family, who were among the richest people in Philadelphia, Black folk who owned their own businesses. The civil rights movement was largely funded by Black people. We don't have to rely on rich Southern white money, and nor do we need to placate that money by moving to the middle, moving further right with our message or our policy. All that we need to do is to activate and organize Black money, brown money, Latino money. That is faith-rooted money.
I love that. Any other thoughts on this question?
Just one quick call. Again, I think the perception is not often caught up with the reality. The Southern Baptist Convention was actually the convention, the group I grew up in, which, by the way, started right in 1845 as a denomination explicitly designed to justify slavery, but became the largest Protestant denomination of any kind by the middle of the 20th century. Has now lost over 2 million members over the last 10 years. Right. So again, yes, they're powerful. Yes, particularly in the South. You can't swing a dead cat without hitting a Southern Baptist, as we would say down there. But that is all true. But the numbers are shrinking. The median age is going up. The writing is clearly on the wall.
And I'll just jump in to say, if it's okay, sorry. One of the most rewarding things I did last fall as I was stuck in my apartment during quarantine alone and really focused on the elections was I signed up to do voter outreach and deep canvassing calls with Surge, showing up for racial justice, and Swing Georgia Left. And earlier in the election season, we signed up for calling either people who didn't vote in 2016 or were registered as independents, specifically white voters, to talk to them about racial justice and the election this year and how they were feeling after the past 4 years. And I'll just say that me being a person of faith, having those conversations with people, like I had people who were in the middle of the grocery store stopping for 15 minutes to talk with me on the phone. The script didn't have that faith language, but I was able to show up in that space, bringing my full self and engage deeper in those conversations. So I would just say in terms of, combating the money and power inherent in those evangelical churches, I think like we just have to look for the places where the work is already being done and see like what gifts do we have and what perspectives do we have that we can bring in to show that there is an alternative, because we can break through in a way that is maybe resonates with different people.
Thank you. I want to turn now to just offer each of our speakers an opportunity to share a closing thought, drawing on a religious tradition or a teaching that offers some hope for our country and our world, just to represent my Islamic faith here in the space. For me, the Quran says, truth has now arrived and falsehood perished, for falsehood by its nature is bound to perish. And the religious right has peddled in the greatest falsehoods, from the big lie to the many blatant lies, both big and small, of the last president. So I have faith that the truth is here. It's just our task to proclaim it. Falsehood was always by its nature bound to perish. Simran, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, thank you. One of the things that our Sikh faith teaches us is that darkness is noticeable. It's easier to notice darkness, and we overlook the light all around us. And as we're sitting here, and Ravi's telling us the numbers of what's happening with the religious right and the moves and the shifts that are occurring in our country, I think we forget sometimes about all the reasons we have for hope. The light that's all around us, the grace that's all around us. And so that's something that I draw from my tradition to remind myself when things feel rough and when things feel difficult, that there really is so much light all around us, and we just have to look for it and notice it.
Thanks. Ravi.
Well, I'm going to draw on James Baldwin here, and who I always finds writes out of his own kind of Christian upbringing and power. I've always found this something I hold on to here. He wrote, if we, and I mean the relatively conscious whites and the relatively conscious blacks, who must, like lovers, insist on or create the consciousness of others, do not falter in our duty now, we may be able, handful that we are, to end the racial nightmare and achieve our country and change the history of the world. And that's something I come back to, this kind of hopefulness. And, that was 50 years ago. We're still here. But I think the work goes on, and I do think the moment that we're in is certainly an opportunity that feels different than anything I've seen in my lifetime, particularly around the racial justice work.
Thank you, Ravi. Ashley, how about you?
People always have questions when they hear that I work in religion and politics, and I know Catholics don't quote the Bible that much or at all, but for me, the thing that really resonates with me is, and why I do this work, is faith without works is dead.
Lisa, bring us home.
Well, in my last book, The Very Good Gospel, I opened the book with a vision of shalom, which actually comes out of course, the Jewish tradition, but the Jewish tradition is a part of my tradition as a Christian. And that vision is one that requires all of us to be in radically good relationship with each other in a way that protects and serves the capacity of every human being to exercise stewardship of this world, to exercise agency in a way that can impact and change the world. But we have a world where policies have been crafted, especially according to racial and gender hierarchies that have created a hierarchy of human belonging. And so what I believe where we get our faith from, or what I get my faith from, is the belief that we are called in our faith to walk toward that vision that we see on the very first page of the Bible, that vision where we are all of us, serving the capacity of all to steward the world. And because that is the vision of our faith, I have faith that we can see it, we can get there, we can begin to move people toward it.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Thank you to the entire panel and to our audience. I am sorry that we did not get to every question there, but particularly for this last question about religious freedom, I wish we could dive into it. I do recommend you go to americanprogress.org and click on under issue areas of religion. We've got a lot on religious freedom, and specifically its intersections with things like reproductive freedom. Thank you all so much today. I encourage everyone in the audience to follow up on with these folks, check out their Twitter, connect with them on social media. Robbie's got that Substack that you may want to subscribe to as well. So thank you all so much. This was a fantastic conversation, and thank you especially to our panelists. Bye-bye.